Alright, so this is the way, while I'm gone, we're going to be doing PowerPoints and lectures once a week. Instead of obviously me being there and me teaching the PowerPoint as we go along, I'll be sending in videos of myself going through the PowerPoints. Also, unlike the typical PowerPoint days, you guys can take the quizzes excuse me, as you watch. So the quizzes will be posted on the classroom, the PowerPoint quizzes. And while you are listening to me, you can pause, stop, answer questions as you go along. And then once you're done with this video, you'll answer any of the questions that you missed, submit your quiz, and then you'll begin working on your vocabulary for the week. So that is the overview of what we're going to do. Today we're going to kind of go quickly through an introduction to Japan. We're moving from China across the bay to Japan, and we're going to talk about a lot of things. Some of them we'll talk about quickly and kind of just do a brief overview of, and some we'll spend a lot more time on. So first, let's talk about Japan's geography. Japan is an archipelago. This will be one of your vocab words. And it basically means it's a chain of islands. So kind of like Hawaii is a chain of islands. And these islands may have at one point been one whole island, and then through time broke off into pieces. But these islands are connected to each other. So there's quite a few archipelagos all across the earth. And it's an important vocabulary word to know. Japan is located about 100 miles off the coast of mainland Asia, so it's right next to Korea and China. Those are the countries that are right next to Japan. Here is a map of where Japan is. You guys can see that it's specifically close to South Korea, and it's the southern part of Japan is close to South Korea, and all the way at the top it's right next to Russia as well. So this is the overview. You guys can see that the waters that separate it from the mainland, it's called the Sea of Japan. Okay, so let's talk about the physical geography of Japan. The four main islands are called Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. Those are the names of the four main islands. You will need to know those at some point. There are also many other little islands, but their names are less important than these four main island names. Japan is actually a very mountainous place. Most of the islands are covered in mountains. So about 4/5, so about 80% of Japan is mountains. So there's not a lot of flat area on Japan, and we'll talk about why that matters later. So where do people live in Japan? Most people live in the narrow river valleys and along coastal plains. Cities are very large in Japan, so most people don't actually live in the country, they live in cities. And Japan has some enormous cities. And we'll watch videos later in the week of life in Japan, modern day Japan, so you guys will get a sense of what it's like. Japan has a pretty mild climate. It's cool temperature, just based on where it is in terms of its latitude. It has quite a bit of rainfall, and this helps farmers. So the oceans, obviously, given that Japan's an island, have allowed Japan to be isolated, meaning that they are separate from everyone else because there's a body of water between them. And the water also served to protect the country because people it was much harder to invade Japan because you would have to get boats and ships. It was close enough to China and Korea. Japan was close enough from China and Korea, yet far enough away to avoid conquest. So they ended up learning a lot and taking a lot of ideas from China and Korea, but China and Korea did not take it over just because of the sheer distance in the body of water separating them. And Japan would later accept some ideas and reject some ideas from China, and we'll talk about what those ideas are. So obviously, being an island, the ocean is very important to Japan. the ocean really helped to define Japan's identity. And we can think about that obviously in things like sushi. So sushi is a world's one of those foods that is had around the world, and it originated in Japan, and it has a lot to do with how Japan uses the oceans. They have a very, very thriving fishing industry. And the ocean was used for Japan also for trade routes. So the ocean was used to make trade with other countries. So Japan is located on the Pacific Ring of Fire. The Pacific Ring of Fire is basically this imaginary line that you guys see. And all along this line is a series of volcanoes. And the Ring of Fire is basically a border around the Pacific Ocean that is made up of volcanoes. So all along this area you have lots and lots of volcanoes. Because there's so many volcanoes, it makes this area really susceptible to earthquakes, which can lead to something called a tsunami. There have been tsunamis in the past, and basically what a tsunami is it's a large underwater earthquake that shifts the water and begins the process of sending large tidal waves which sweep over land without warning. And these can be very, very dangerous, and they have happened not only in Japan but lots of countries around the world. So let's talk about the early history of Japan. The people we know as Japanese migrated from the mainland about 2,000 years ago. So the people that have lived in Japan have not lived there quite as long as other places that we've studied. The early Japanese society was divided into clans called the Uji. These clans were small clans, and they weren't very well organized just yet. It's very early stages. But they did have a chief and a special god or goddess. And so they not only had government, but they also had religion. Early on in Japan, women had a higher role than they would later, and some women actually became leaders of a clan. So let's talk about the Yamato dynasty. The original dynasty, meaning the first one, was the Yamato dynasty. It ruled a pretty large government from Honshu. You guys can see Honshu on the map over there. And current emperors, or people that rule Japan, try to trace their ancestry, meaning their relatives, all the way back to Honshu to show that they're like the original or like the OG rulers that go all the way back to the beginning. One of the earliest religions that was developed, and this is the main one that is a Japanese-only religion. The other religions that would be in Japan would all be imports, meaning they came from other countries. This original religion is called Shinto, and Shinto is kind of a nature religion. So people would worship forces of nature, so whether that's wind or water or different aspects of nature. Shinto was about respecting the forces of nature that guide life. And Shinto literally means the way of the kami, and the kami are these forces of nature or spirits that live in nature. There's a lot of people in Japan that still practice Shinto today. And we'll spend some more time reading about Shinto religion as the week goes on. So let's talk about the influence of Korea on Japan. So the Japanese language is related to Korean. They're fairly similar. You guys will work on some Duolingo stuff with Korean and Japanese, and you guys will be able to see the differences in the characters. Remember last week when you guys worked on the Chinese language, you guys focused on the characters. Those are the little kind of like little artistic shapes that were drawn. And these characters mean words or different things. And so a lot of the written language that we have of Japan was brought to Japan from Korea. Okay. In addition, Korean missionaries also brought Buddhism, which is another religion, to Japan in the 500s. People were very interested in these ideas, and this sparked an interest in learning more about mainland culture. So lots of people were sent to China. In particular, this guy named Prince Shotoku sent some nobles to study in China. So for 200 years, Japanese students, monks, and traders would visit the Tang court, was the name of the government back then in China, and would study with leaders there to gather ideas. One of the main ones that they brought back was a government similar to the Chinese government, with a clear hierarchy. Hierarchy means like different levels of who is in charge. So, we're going to skip over this idea. Well, we're not going to skip over it actually. Let's briefly talk about it. Cultural diffusion, it sounds like a fancy word. Basically what it means is that Japan took certain ideas from China. That's all it means. So for example, they adopted pagoda architecture from Chinese Buddhists. They adopted this idea from China called filial piety, which means that children should be loyal to their parents. And so many of these traditions, which became important in Japan, were taken directly from China. That's a pagoda. It's a holy structure. It's part of the Buddhist religion, and it was something that was created in China that the Japanese adopted. All right, this is a pretty important little pyramid here that you guys will be expected to know. So all across the countryside of Japan, different clans would fight for control. Armies would struggle for power, and eventually a feudal system, just like there was in Europe, which we studied towards the beginning of the year, emerged. And this warrior aristocracy, basically this group of warriors, emerged in Japan. So the emperor, who would sound like the most important figure, was actually very powerless. It was just a ceremonial position. He didn't actually rule. It was actually the shoguns who ruled. The shogun was the supreme military commander, and he had the real power. So he actually controlled life in Japan. Underneath him was the daimyo. The daimyo was is a great warrior lord, and basically the shogun would give the daimyo land, and the daimyo would protect the shogun. And underneath that is something that you probably all know about, are the samurai. And basically these were the knights or soldiers that fought for the daimyo. These are some pictures as well as some sculptures of these various classes of warriors. So samurai. What does samurai mean? Samurai means those who serve. So a samurai was someone who dedicated their life to fighting for their ruler, their daimyo. It's quite comparable actually to Christian knights in Europe. So the same way that knights would go on one knee and pledge their loyalty to the king, the samurai would do the same. They had a certain code that they lived by, the samurai. It was called Bushido. Basically, Bushido is a series of rules to live by if you are a samurai. These rules are a lot to do with how to behave in battle, as well as how to live your life outside of battle. So, here's a comparison with Europe. The emperor is kind of like the king. You have the shogun, comparable to the lord, and the daimyo, comparable to the lesser lord. And then the warriors in Europe are called knights. In Japan, they were called samurai. And the knights in Europe lived by a code of chivalry, whereas the samurai lived by the code of Bushido. So the shogun, Yoritomo Minamoto, set up the first three military dynasties that ruled the world, or Japan, for the first 700 years. It became known as the Kamakura Shogunate. And so this one guy right here would set up how Japan would be ruled for nearly 700 years. So we talked about early on that there were women leaders of clans in the early days of the Japan's history. But during the age of the samurai, women declined in importance in society. Basically, as Japan became more militaristic, women's role got less and less. And the Code of the Samurai also put women in a place where they had less power. And then the importance of arranged marriages started to come into use. So people would choose who you married. So back to Buddhism. Buddhism came to Japan through Korea. As it spread, Japanese adopted a lot of the ideas and practices of Korean Buddhism, so those shrines that we saw called pagodas, as well as monasteries where Buddhist monks would live. So all of these ideas were part of what's called the Korean Bridge, which was a basically not a real bridge, but a idea bridge that went back and forth with Korea. So we talked a little bit about some of these ideas already. We're going to skip on and skip these here at the end as well. And that's about it. So overall, hopefully you learned a little bit about what makes Japan interesting, as well as the different groups that are part of it. So your job now is to finish the quiz that you started at the beginning, and then once you get done with that, there will be some vocabulary terms that you will need to go and work on. Try to get as many of the different categories with a green box or a green check mark as you can today. And that's all for today. I hope everything is going well, and talk to you guys later.